So there's a story that comes up in our family from time to time. It goes back to my childhood. I wasn't an actor in the story. I was just there and remember it as well. And it's a story about the time our family went out to the Pittsburgh area to visit one of my dad's Navy buddies. Sometimes they came to Eastern Pennsylvania and would visit us, and we would see them. And I remember we went over to their home to visit, and we stayed for dinner, and it was their family of four and our family of four around the table. And at the end of the meal, my mother got up to help clear the table. And she began to collect plates and stack them up. And our hostess yelled, "Stop stacking the plates. Now I have to wash both sides of them." And she was very serious and very angry. And we were all like, wow, that's new. This was not fine china. This was like your everyday Corelware or something like that. And in our house, you just stack the plates and put them next to the counter and you wash them and then put them in the drying rack. I have learned, and don't feel bad if you're not a plate stacker, but I did learn last night that there are some people who don't stack plates in their house either. And I can see there's some reasons and occasions that might be true. I don't mean to denigrate you non-plate stackers. But for us, it's told in a humorous way now. And the truth is, though, as I think back upon it, it's not that big a deal. The reaction is why we tell the story, not the fact that she didn't want to stack her plates. Because frankly, we can do whatever we want with our plates, right? We get to decide. Short of things like the commandments and certain laws, we each decide how uniquely we want to operate in this world and how we're going to do things, and we clearly don't always do them the same as everybody else. Now that's true in church too. You don't have to go far. In fact, you don't have to find another congregation to be reminded of just how much variation there is in the Episcopal Church. We have numerous different liturgies in 2 different chapels every weekend at Christ Church, so there are slight things that look different from service to service, and certainly between Episcopal Church and Episcopal Church, let alone other denominations. You know, it depends on what the priest wears changes, or how we do the readings, or how we receive communion, or when we kneel, even what things we sing and the types of things we sing are all different variations. None of them are right or wrong per se, although you'll meet people who try to convince you otherwise. They're all faithful if they hold meaning for us, and that's important to us to do it that way, and we own it. That's perfectly fine. The downside is when our doing something our way leads us to believe that other people's ways are wrong and bad. And then we begin to judge them because they do it differently than we do. Now, we tend to think less of people sometimes because of their differences, because we have to make assumptions about them as an individual. We can't help it. And we only have what's before us. So it's the things they do or don't do, the things they say or don't say that we can process. In today's gospel, we get an introduction of another factor that matters to God that is outside of our realm, which should impact some of our behavior, that God can see all that but isn't swayed by all that the way that we might be. God looks at the heart. So the truth is, there are times we do things or don't do things because we know other people are looking at us and making snap judgments about us, right? So we might do or not do something to either be judged a certain way or not be judged a certain way. And it's the little bit of the game that we play in this life. And our gospel today is saying in some cases that can be problematic. And what we need to be thinking about is what's in here, and that's what God is looking at, and not to get distracted by all the rest of it. And today we enter into that because of a story about washing hands. I'm grateful that we're out of the Bread of Life discourse, as lovely as it was for the last 5 weeks. I got a little nervous when I realized we were still in the category of food, but now we've moved from what we're eating to how we prepare to eat in this little dust-up between Jesus and the Pharisees and scribes when they notice that some of the disciples have not washed their hands. Now, often when we hear these disputes over the purity codes in ancient Israel, we get a little high and mighty at times about those silly Jewish rituals and how silly they are to try to fulfill them because we don't really understand them. We don't have a lot of equivalents today. And we tend to think that, oh, they only did that because that's how they thought they got into heaven, or that's how they got on God's good side. And so before we go any further, it's helpful to remember that this question that's asked of Jesus is not necessarily a question because somebody wants to be a jerk and to try to get Jesus on something. It's because the law as God handed it down was gift. And your living into that law is how you honor God. Living into the law is how you glorify God. And so when you hear a question, why do your disciples not follow the practice of the elders and wash their hands? It's also a way of saying, why are you not honoring God? And so it becomes a little bit bigger of a question. Now, I do think we can relate to this purity ritual. It's not totally foreign to us in 2024. If you watch what happens as we prepare the table every single Sunday, you will notice that priests still wash their hands in a rather archaic ceremonial way, where the acolyte or the server pours water into a little bowl over our fingertips. That is more ceremonial as we recall those ancient rituals of purifying ourselves, and priests are usually saying a silent prayer as that happens before we come to the table, just as the priests in ancient Israel. Now, it blossomed out to all the people in ancient Israel washing their hands before eating, and we don't have a hand washing station for communion. We just let it happen up there. And it's not the CDC version of how you prepare to serve food by washing hands, but it means something nonetheless. Now, we also use hand sanitizer if you watch as well. We even got metal containers, so it wasn't as ridiculous as a Purell bottle or something up there, because we do worry about germs in a real sense as well. And that's also built into some of these purity codes at the same time. So if you think about it from a worldview before we knew about science and foodborne illness and pathology, you would learn over time that when people washed their hands, they didn't get as sick. When people didn't wash their hands, you started to realize, oh, maybe people are getting sick from that. Except they wouldn't have thought about it in terms of germs. They would have thought about it in terms of God. And they would have said, oh, when we don't wash our hands and people get sick, we've upset God, and God is punishing us with this illness. Therefore, God must want us to wash our hands. And it gets built into a code that really was about keeping people healthy and safe, and not just about having a rule for the sake of having a rule. So hand washing matters on several levels. And it still matters for us today. I can't tell you how annoyed I get, how grossed out I get when I'm in a public restroom and I see somebody finish up their business and leave the restroom without washing their hands. I see it far too often in men's rooms. I cannot speak to ladies' rooms. I'd like to think that doesn't happen there, but who knows? And it really doesn't matter which restroom it is. It could be one of the truck stops on 95 when we stop for gas, or it could be over on Sea Island. And no matter where it is, my thought is there a handle on the door that I'm going to have to touch that they just touched? Or depending on the circumstance, what else are they out there touching that I'm going to go out and touch? And I think less of those people, frankly. And I'm sorry if you're one of them. You should wash your hands. It's gross. And it really upsets me. And you should know that I think less of you because of it. And then I realized that's not that different from what's happening in the gospel. Right? I see one moment in somebody's choice. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they're thinking about Sunday's sermon and they just forgot. They didn't wash their hands. And I automatically think, oh, you're a terrible person. You don't wash your hands. And we realize that sometimes we get a little ahead of ourselves by taking what is right in front of us and applying it to a person's value and worth. And we take it too far and we diminish them. And Jesus has something to say to us about that. Sometimes we get this idea of assigning value a little mixed up, and if we bring God into the mix, it gets even more tricky very quickly. Let me give you another example. How many of you know the phrase, God helps those who help themselves? You know that phrase? Okay. Can anybody tell me, is it Hebrew Scriptures or New Testament?
Neither.
Gospel? Epistle?
Nowhere.
It's not in the Bible. But it's one of those sayings on the short list of things people swear is in there somewhere, and many people think it's something Jesus said. It's actually from ancient Greece. So it could have been around in Jesus' day. I mean, it could have been something that was there, but he didn't say it. And nowhere in Holy Scripture does it appear. But what it is a moment where we come up with a worldview or a piece of theology that fits what's already our human behavior. And I think we can relate to it. Sometimes we find somebody in need of help, but we look at them and say, there's something about you that's irresponsible, or you're lazy. And I don't want to give up my time and energy or my money to help you. You should have done this for yourself, like I do for myself, and like I taught my children to do for themselves. And what happens over time is that when you hear a saying like God helps those who help themselves, you can see cause and effect in God's goodness and God's withholding of goodness based on the outcome. It's a logical thing. The people who have planned well, who have saved up for a long winter, whatever it may be, they fare better. And again, that must mean they have God's favor, and the people who don't. And so what happens is we see it that way. We say, well, I don't want to do this, and clearly God doesn't like it either. So now I have an excuse to do what I didn't want to do in the first place. And not only that, but I can feel a sense that they deserve what they have or don't have, and that it's not my problem. Even if that goes against what the gospel teaches, in the back of our head, once we assign that to some divine truth that God helps those who help themselves, all of a sudden we're off the hook. And that becomes a problem. We hold the assumption we make about people against them, which is unfair. We do this in other ways that are a little less daunting and a little more fun. For example, we've gotten up to Sewanee a couple times recently to get Eva settled for her move-in and then orientation after her pre-program. And while we were there, I was reminded of the old Sewanee football cheer that some of you will know that's been used at football games for a long time. Although Paul Salter reminded me last night, we don't often have much to cheer about in the world of Sewanee football these days. But there's this old cheer that says, rip 'em up, tear 'em up, leave 'em in the lurch. Down with the heathens, up with the church. Yay, Sewanee's right. Okay. And you still see YSR all over the place in Sewanee. You see it on people's bumpers. YSR is Yay, Sewanee's right from that old football cheer. The beginning doesn't sound like a church cheer to me. Rip 'em up, tear 'em up. Yay! And you can imagine them shouting this across the field at some of the schools they played 100 years ago when they were good. The best team in the SEC, I must say, with the best record ever in the history of the SEC, I must say. But that was 100 years ago. But imagine them shouting about these heathens as they played those heathen Vanderbilt Methodists. You know? And you realize, okay, it's a little bit in fun. They didn't really think they were playing against heathens. And this is what we do in team sports. We have our team, we root for our team, we say bad things about the other team. That's part of the fun. I'm sure that there were some things said about Clemson yesterday in our neighborhoods, and then some great cheering when UGA was, of course, triumphant. But we also know, if we're honest, that when we watch sporting events, the team that we root for colors how we judge what happens on the field. So the refs are always harder on us than they are on the team. They don't see the stuff, but then they call us on it. We get angry, and there's all these things that we see that are out of whack. We know it on some level. We do get angry sometimes, but really it's all in fun on the field when we realize that our perception is different because we claim a team and the other side as the adversary. And that's fine, and it's fun until that mindset moves outside of a sporting engagement that's just for fun and out into the real world. And you take a cheer like, hey, Sewanee's right, and you put some other title for some other group or some other team in there that in some situations is going to be very unhelpful. There are occasions where we might want to stand up and say, yay, America's right. And it's actually not going to be the right thing in that moment. We see every day the effect of saying, yay, my political party's right. And what that's doing. And that's not helpful. And some of the scary folks are the ones who say, my ethnicity is right. And there's all these different cheers that we use in different ways, when all it really does is signify somebody's admission that they're seeing the world from a skewed perspective, right or wrong, that gives them a different perspective than whoever's on the other side as we look at things like justice and fairness and the history that we tell about what happened on the field in any particular day. And it becomes a little bit of a slippery slope that we all slip and stumble on, and we have to be careful about. You don't wash your hands. You've broken a rule. Maybe now you've broken a law. And if you've broken a law that God holds up, now you're in God's disfavor. And I've got God behind me when I say terrible things about you, when I denigrate you, when I diminish you. And if that goes on long enough and far enough, eventually, if it serves my purpose, I can persecute you in some way because you deserve whatever you get, you filthy person who doesn't wash their hands. And you can see how that doesn't always work out well if it goes too far. We've been like this forever. This is how human beings are. It's not necessarily bad. It's just part of our human nature. As long as there have been humans, this has been how we group ourselves and fight with ourselves and all the rest of it. And it's into that reality this morning that we hear Jesus in the gospel saying, stop for a second. You can't jump from point A to point Z just because of something like hand washing. God's looking at something a little more important in these scenarios than what you might find important in the moment. It's about what's in here and what God sees here. God's going to look into our heart, and God's going to take a measure of whether God finds righteousness or wickedness. And an honest answer is that when God looks in our hearts, God finds a mix of both, right? That's just who we are. Which means that we want to be very careful about trying to make any judgments of someone's worth and value based on the external things of this world, many of which we've put on them unfairly in the ways that we want to judge them. We should be very careful about value judgments about things like politics or race or wealth or education, heaven forbid a sports team or a denomination or a neighborhood or whatever the various things are that we've got in our heads that serve as purity tests for someone's value and worthiness, which we sometimes attribute God into the midst of as well unfairly. But righteousness isn't about clean hands and meeting those kind of purity tests. Righteousness is about clean hearts that have been cleansed by the love of a God who sees beyond our shortcomings and our wickedness and the places where we fall short and where we sin and we screw up, and shows us a deep and abiding love anyway. God's favor, God's goodness, God's salvation does not go to the people that we tend to think it's going to go to based on our limited information and our assumptions. The whole endeavor is much bigger than what we can perceive or should be worried about trying to perceive. Because we're much better off trying to figure out how to foster hearts full of love, hearts full of righteousness, and live out of that than we should be pointing at other people about their wickedness or how they're different or how they're weird because they don't stack their plates or whatever it may be. Because we don't want anybody to be making those value judgments by us when we screw up and they know it, or they catch us out, when they only know the worst parts of ourselves and not what we're dealing with behind the scenes that caused us to act out. And we should be very grateful that that's not how God operates either. God looks beyond all that and knows what's true and knows where we really need to do some work and where it is that we have to fill in the gaps. And in recognizing that, it should move us towards a stance that is grace-filled, that is about reconciliation and rebuilding, because that's what we've experienced for ourselves and that's what we yearn for each other, right? That's what a heart full of righteousness looks like. That's what righteousness is when it's embodied and when it's lived out, when it is based on that same love of God. I know you all know the great reading from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Many of us had it read at our weddings or have heard it read at least one wedding, but probably several. When he says things like, I can move a mountain, but if I don't have love, I'm nothing. He says, I can give away everything I have and I can boast about it. But if I don't have love, I've gained nothing. And so the question becomes not, do you stack the plates or not? It's, do you have love? It's not, do you wash your hands or not? It's, where is the love in your heart? It's not, do you root for your team and root against the other side? But where does heart enter into the equation? Where is love in the midst of that? Because as our epistle today calls us, this is something we have to embody, something we have to live out. When it says in James that you should be doers of the word, not hearers only. Do not be like those who deceive themselves. We're good at that. We can deceive ourselves. We can try to deceive and fool others. We can make all kinds of faulty assumptions and forget that God is not easily deceived. God is no fool. And so for us, this is about making sure we learn to focus on what's in here. Not pretend, not phone it in, not make up stories about people to make ourselves feel better or about the assumptions that we have about them, but to focus on what's in here and what comes out of here. Because that's what's most important.